Thanks a lot for coming. I am Andrew Blick. I'm Head of Department of Political Economy until August the 1st. And I am very pleased to be chairing this panel. I'm very pleased to be Head of Department, but I'm very pleased to be chairing this panel tonight on elections. We've actually got a great panel of people either in DPE or friends of DPE, so it's very great that it's such an in-house kind of event. So we're going to have 4 speakers followed by questions. We're going to start with Professor Sarah Birch, who specialises in various things. I think doing a lot of the work at the moment on environmental politics, but also specialises in electoral integrity. So Sarah, if I can hand over to you first, please.
Thank you very much. Great to be here. It was hot yesterday, wasn't it? Hottest day of the year so far. And next week is going to be July, which is when the election is going to be, and July is historically the hottest month of the year. So what I'm going to be talking about is election timing and the implications of calling an election in July. It's the first July election we will have had since 1945, just at the tail end of the Second World War. So the UK doesn't really have July elections a whole lot. I've prepared some PowerPoint slides, but the system doesn't seem to be working. So I'm just going to, if you see me looking at the screen, it's because I don't have any notes, the slides are my notes. But anyway, think back 2 years to July 2 years ago, 2022. The UK had its first ever heat emergency. There was a red alert for heat. Network Rail was issuing do not travel warnings. The mercury hit 40 degrees for the first time in the UK. It was very hot. Now, think forward to this year, just a few weeks ago, in May, in India, where it went up to 50 degrees, and they were voting. And at least 33 people who work in polling stations died because of the heat. And a lot of voters also suffered medical problems because of the heat. And this is not the only recent election that's been affected by heat. As a matter of fact, we're in an El Nino year this year, and we're also having a lot of elections. And so there have been a number of elections that have been affected by heat, but also France 2022, Spain last year, and this year the Maldives, Romania, Mexico, India, as I said, and also the United States, where some campaign events that were held recently in places like Texas and Arizona. There was an early heat wave, unexpectedly early heat wave in those states, and there were some people who fell ill with heat-related illnesses in those election campaigns. So it's a hot year, we're having a lot of elections, and now the forecast for next week is actually not that hot. Of course, it could get hot, but it sounds like it's going to be a relatively moderate, typical English summer week, and so we're probably not going to have a heat wave, but we could have. So calling an election in July is a risk for any government because of the risk potentially of having hotter temperatures. And indeed, temperatures have been rising in July. Temperatures are now over a degree Celsius above what they were historically back in the mid-century. So why a July election? Well, we don't know exactly. None of us is inside the mind of Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, but certainly there are undoubtedly economic considerations. Possibly Prime Minister decided that the economy was not necessarily going to be getting any better than it is at the moment. Inflation is finally under control. Perhaps he thought, well, this is, is potentially a risk in waiting now that inflation has largely been tamed. It might be a good idea to exploit this. Potentially also, if you're a bit cynical, you might note that July is the time when people in Scotland traditionally take their holidays. It's the time when a lot of students are often kind of on the move, not necessarily in the place that they're registered to vote. So you might think that differential turnout would potentially benefit the Conservatives. There's also the surprise factor. And the other political parties were probably expecting an autumn election, so maybe they hadn't got all their plans in place, their candidates in place, their funding in place to fight an election in July. Possibly also fatigue. Maybe the Prime Minister just thought, well, I've had enough of this. Just might as well get it over with so I can have a summer holiday. Certainly some of the developments within the political party system were bringing to light some things that were dividing the Conservative Party, and so perhaps they felt it was better just to do it sooner rather than later. I don't know. I think probably some of the other panelists can shed more light on that. What I'm going to talk about is the possible implications of calling an election in July when it is often, sometimes, hot, quite hot. So, risks associated with campaigning and voting in the heat. Firstly, the challenges for canvassers and candidates. Okay, we may be voting next week. Most of us who are not casting a post on that, people are out canvassing now. They were out canvassing yesterday in 30-degree heat. Right? They were knocking on people's doors, potentially suffering heat-related problems because of that. Candidates out trying to go around the country and talk to people when it's very hot. Also, if it does get hot next week, still possibly could, there might be reduced turnout among vulnerable groups, including the elderly. So that's a group that the Conservatives rely on more than other parties do for votes. And so this is not necessarily a choice that necessarily benefited the party that called the election. And there may well be health issues at the polling stations for the people who work in the polling stations, for voters if they have to wait a long time. And also greater salience of climate change. We know from a lot of studies that have been conducted that when it's hot, people think about climate change. And this is not a policy area in which the Conservatives are particularly strong. So there are risks for the Conservatives in holding a July election that do not obtain for the other political parties. So in that sense, the potential for heat at the time of the election was not necessarily something that stood to benefit the Conservatives. And so if the July election was obviously called despite the risk of it being very hot and people thinking about climate change and elderly people deciding it would be better to stay home and not go out to the polling station. In one sense, you might say, well, this is good. This means that we don't have prime ministers who will manipulate weather cycles to benefit themselves. There wasn't, a choice of a polling date that would make it easier for the Conservatives. It's actually the opposite. On the other hand, there was a significant risk that there would be adverse consequences for quite a lot of people if weather forecasts weren't for relatively modest temperatures next week. And I myself have done some research that focuses on the last several elections. And you may recall in December 2019, we had the last general election, there had just been quite a lot of flooding. And flooding, like heat, is something that makes people, in the UK at least, think about climate change. My research showed that the Labour Party actually benefited by approximately 2 percentage points from the flooding that had taken place, because people were turning to the Labour Party as the party they thought could help them to help address climate change more than the party in power. So again, the choice of a July election was not necessarily one that was optimal from a political point of view. And indeed, we haven't had July elections. As I said, it's the first time from 1944. We haven't had elections very often in the UK in recent years, at times in the year when we're likely to have weather that makes it difficult to get to the polls. We have only actually, since October 1974, had 3 elections that are not in either May or June. 1992 was an April election, 2019 was a December election, this year is a July election. All of the other elections in the last nearly 50 years have been held either in May or June. And why? Well, weather's usually okay in May and June. We tend to get storms in the autumn and the winter. We tend to get heat in the summer, and May and June tends to be a time of year where the weather is not likely to disrupt the electoral process. So it would seem to make sense to actually lock that into our political system. You may recall we used to have a Fixed Term Parliaments Act that required parliamentary elections to be called at a particular time, except in certain unusual circumstances. And it would seem to make a lot of sense to lock in the practice that's been very commonly observed over the last 50 years, to hold elections in May or June, so to bring back a version of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, so there would be a window every spring, early summer, when Prime Minister could call an election up to the 5-year limit, and then once that window passed, they would have to wait till the next year. Because it is going to get hotter, we are going to have more storms in the autumn and the winter, according to the climate change predictions, and holding elections at a time of year where there's a risk of the weather disrupting elections, making it difficult for people to vote, killing people, possibly even who are working in polling stations if it gets very hot, making it difficult for people to campaign, that is not a good idea. Calling an election in July is highly risky, and it is probably something we shouldn't be having. So we should be having elections in May and June, and I think it would make sense to consider actually making that a legal requirement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next we go to Roger Mortimore. Roger is Professor of Public Opinion and Political Analysis here with us at DPE, and he's also Director of Political Analysis at Ipsos Mori. And Roger, before anything, does it have a policy on gambling for...
It is assumed that we will not.
Okay, I just wanted... Okay. Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot there. I was just interested. But yeah, please, so over to you, Roger.
Thanks. As Andrew said, my speciality is studying and conducting opinion polls, so I thought probably the most useful thing I could talk about today is what the polls are telling us about where we are at the moment. So I'm going to run through some of the numbers, tell you in perhaps a little bit more depth than you'll get from the media what I think those numbers mean, and try and give you some idea why I think they're probably relatively reliable. I think all the polls I'm actually going to talk about are the Ipsos polls. As Andrew said, I work for Ipsos, so those are the numbers that I am most familiar with, and I'm reasonably well informed on the way in which all the Ipsos polls have been done, and I'm reasonably confident that they are. As professional and properly conducted as I can hope, I don't want to slag off any of our commercial rivals, so I'm not saying that everybody else's polls are inferior or wrong, but at least I do have a reasonable amount of confidence in the Ipsos ones. And I mean, it has been obvious over this election that there's a relatively large amount of variation between the different polls. Now, one of the reasons for that is just the ridiculous number of polls that we now have. There are something like 20 companies producing polls at the moment, which is pretty well double what it has been in previous elections. Some of those are companies that are not particularly experienced. Maybe they are totally on top of it and will get it right. Maybe they all won't. But anyway, it's the Ipsos numbers I'm going to talk about. The latest Ipsos poll on voting intention came out yesterday, and we have Labour on 42% and the Conservatives on 19%. That would be, if it were to be the result next week, the worst Conservative share of the vote in history, and I think the worst performance by far of any government defending its record in British history. Far worse than John Major suffered in 1997. For Labour, 42%, I mean, it's a good result. In these circumstances, it's going to be a clear victory, but it's not quite so unprecedented or historic. I mean, it's actually a smaller share of the vote than Tony Blair got in 1997. It's a lot smaller than Clement Attlee got in 1945. But the opposition to Tony Blair and the opposition to Clement Attlee looked more credible to the voters than the opposition to Keir Starmer does, and Keir Starmer is going to reap the benefit of that. So in terms of, I guess, what really matters, what would that mean in seats if people voted that way? Uniform swing is the best starting point for understanding what shares of the vote mean. Now, as I'm sure many of you will know, the tradition in studying British elections is to use uniform swing, to assume basically that all parts of the country have changed their opinion by the same amount since the last election. Now, that's a pretty crude approximation, but actually in terms of estimating what's going to happen overall, it has a pretty good record. It does seem to be a relatively good, though very crude, model of the way British elections work. And looking at these numbers that we've got at the moment, now remember this is not a prediction, there's still a week to go, and I don't want to guarantee that the numbers will be perfect anyway, but those numbers give us a swing of 17.5% since the last election. Again, that is completely unprecedented in the gap between any two British elections, at least over the period where British elections have been decided on popular votes. What that means is that all other things being equal, and ignoring any local variations, ignoring good candidates who can outperform their party performance and so on, the Tories should expect to lose any seat where they had a lead of less than 35% of the vote at the last election. So just let that sink in. If they won the constituency last time, say 60% Conservative, 30% Labour, 10% the rest, they're not going to be with a realistic chance of saving that seat this time. It is a huge turnover of votes, and it's going to have a huge impact in turnover of seats. And I know some people, simply for that reason, are finding it difficult to believe what's happening at the moment, to say that the polls must be wrong because you don't get swings that big. But what we're actually talking about is just people changing their opinions. People changing their opinions is not hard, and if the circumstances are right, yes, we can get a swing that big, and I believe we have got a swing approximately that big. So what that's going to mean in practical terms next Thursday, if you're thinking about what are going to be the Portillo moments next week, who are the government ministers that you can watch when they unexpectedly lose their seats, to pick out a couple of names I've seen thrown around in the media, we'll talk about Grant Shapps or Jacob Rees-Mogg. Neither of them are going to be surprised. They're going to lose by a landslide. Only politicians who have really safe seats in the Conservative Party can be reasonably confident of hanging on to them. And in terms of assuming there is a uniform swing, and again remembering that it is possible that some of these ministers will be able to find an extra bit of personal vote to shore up their performance. Maybe the tactical voting will work out differently or whatever. But Jeremy Hunt and Penny Mordaunt are both going to find it hard to hold their seats. They are both, at the moment, liable to lose if there is a uniform swing as big as the polls are saying. Michael Gove, at the moment, on uniform swing will hang on, but is very vulnerable if the tactical voting works properly against him. It's only a very small number of the top ministers and of obscure backbenchers that many of us have never heard of who are going to be hanging on to their seats. And of course that's going to have an impact after next Thursday when the Conservatives are electing their new leader, exactly as it did in 1997. Everybody remembers Michael Portillo losing his seat, and he therefore wasn't able to take part in the leadership election. Perhaps not quite so many people remember the other very plausible candidate, Malcolm Rifkind, losing his seat and not being able to fight in that leadership election. And we could easily be looking at something very similar in the Conservative Party after next Thursday. But that's all speculation. That is the sort of scale of movement we're talking about. Now, as many of you will know, there is a special kind of opinion poll called an MRP poll, which is especially aimed at doing detailed projections of the results in every seat, rather than just relying on uniform swing. Again, there have been quite a lot of these published, and some of them are showing very dramatic figures in terms of numbers of seats that the Conservatives will be left with. I've seen at least one poll talking of the Conservatives being reduced to the regions of 50 seats. I don't think that's remotely likely. looking at this technically, which is obviously the sort of thing that pollsters do, and also the sort of thing that political scientists do, trying to work out how are these polls built up, what are the assumptions that are built into them, how are they modelling the seats. One of the things that has been suggested is that MRP polls exaggerate the number of seats that a party will lose. And the reason that is said is that, as I've already mentioned, uniform swing is normally the way in which British elections work. A party loses roughly the same share of its vote in the marginal seats and in its safe seats and in the seats it's never got a chance of winning in the first place. A lot of the MRP polls recently have been showing something very different. They've been showing a bigger swing in the Conservative safest seats, essentially what's called proportional swing. So party loses proportionally, the more votes they've got to lose, the more they lose. And that was one reason why a few months ago some people were attacking the MRP polls, and they were saying that these polls are built around a model that actually has never happened in what we know about history of British elections. And I and many other people involved in doing MRP polls were somewhat worried by that idea, and we looked into it before we published our only MRP poll. And there is a reason that the MRP polls are showing bigger swings in safe seats. And that's because when you look at the raw data, before we've done any modelling with it, before we fiddled with it, just when we look at who we've asked how they're going to vote and where they are, the people in the safe seats are saying they are more likely to swing than the people anywhere else. So actually, those MRP polls are probably right. The number of seats the Conservatives are going to win is probably bigger than it would be if there was just a uniform swing. So on the numbers I've given you earlier on uniform swing, the Conservatives would be on around 150 or 160 seats. Our MRP poll, which I say I don't want to claim it's necessarily much better than anybody else's, but I'm reasonably confident that it's not hopelessly bad, we projected 115 Conservative seats. So I think that is very roughly the sort of thing we are looking at next week, assuming nothing changes and assuming we've got our modelling right. Well, that's dramatic stuff. And of course, opinion polls have sometimes got elections wrong before. So why do I think that might be true? When the polls have got the elections a little bit wrong in the past, when we've looked at them afterwards, we've nearly always found there was some obvious clue that we missed, that maybe it wasn't as simple as we thought it was. So back in 1997, for example, when the polls did overestimate the scale of Tony Blair's landslide, and even more in 1992, when the polls were saying there was going to be a dead heat between Neil Kinnock and John Major, and actually John Major won fairly comfortably. When you dug into the detail of the other poll, and particularly looked at the leadership polls, for example, John Major was viewed much better as a leader than the Conservative Party were viewed in voting intention. And if we'd noticed that and worried about that, maybe we would have been a little bit less sure that the voting intention polls are right. But everything I look at in the polling in this election is consistent. Rishi Sunak's leadership stats are awful. He's got by far the worst ratings of any Prime Minister in the history of British opinion polls. The Conservative Party is badly rated. People, you see the numbers, 72% of the public say they dislike the Conservatives. 83% are dissatisfied with the way the government's running the country. Now, Labour's figures and Keir Starmer's figures are not impressive, but they're a lot better than that. When I look at what are the important issues facing the country, what do the public say this election is about? It's about health, it's about the economy and inflation, it's about immigration. Labour is always ahead in elections on health, and they're way ahead in this election on health. The Tories are usually ahead on immigration, but they're not in this election. Labour is winning on immigration 2-1. And Labour is winning on economic issues. Labour is winning on inflation. So everything is adding up to a consistent picture that the voters just are so fed up with this government that although they're not that enthusiastic about Keir Starmer, and I think that's been very clear over all these weeks of, frankly, one of the dullest elections I can remember. There is no great enthusiasm for the new government that's going to take over on Friday, but I think enough of the voters are determined to vote to let that happen anyway, that it's going to happen. There could be some change. I think it's possible that a lot of that big bulk of voters, 15% in our polls, more in other polls, who say they're going to vote reform, will suddenly at the last minute decide actually they'd rather Labour didn't have quite that big a majority and a vote for reform's a wasted vote anyway. So maybe a bit of the votes will come back to the Conservatives. But even if we got the biggest movement in the final week in the polls that we've ever had in British elections, and even if the polls are twice as wrong as they've ever been in the past, Labour will still be ahead next Thursday. One final point for I end, just a speculation following up on Sarah's point. Given all of this, why on earth did Rishi Sunak go now? I'm just wondering, has Rishi Sunak or one of his advisors fallen for the famous myth of the 1970 election and the World Cup? It is a theory, or was much talked about at the time, that the reason that Labour suddenly and unexpectedly lost the 1970 election was that England were knocked out of the World Cup 4 days before polling day. And the myth has therefore grown around that. If we could win a World Cup during the election, that would be great for the government. Has Rishi Sunak looked at Euro 24 and thought England will still be in Euro 24 on polling day? Is he looking at the T20 World Cup and England is still in that? Does he think we're going to win that as well? Maybe we will win both. But again, that is not going to save the Conservatives in this election. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. And I was just looking at the 1906 election when the Conservatives came away with 156 seats out of 670 seats in total at that point. So we are looking, the kind of thing you're talking about, we're looking at that ballpark. Or
well, wait a minute. In that election, I think the Liberals got about 43% of the vote. Sorry, the Liberals got about 49% of the vote, and the Tories about 43%. Yeah. But the electoral geography being so much more evenly spread, it led to a huge majority. You got swings with very large majorities before the First World War. You need much larger swings now to get those sort of majorities.
Yeah, oh, that's absolutely right. But in terms of seats actually won,
I don't know what the swing was between 1900 and 1996. You could work it out if you got the figures.
The Conservatives lost 6.8, the Liberals gained 3.8.
So the swing would be 10.6. Swing's only about 5.3%.
There we go, yeah. And the Irish Parliamentary Party did very well with concentration of a small number of votes. Yeah. Anyway, we now go on to Rosie Campbell. Rosie is Professor of Politics and Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership here at King's. Her speciality areas include public opinion, political behaviour, political representation and gender and politics. So over to you, please, Rosie.
Thank you very much. I regularly attend, as does Sarah and Roger, the elections, and Peter John over there, the Elections and Public Opinion conference that's run annually. And there is usually a quiz, and there's a massive competition to get Roger on your team, because Roger knows all the answers. And on election night, I'm due to be on Channel 4 overnight, and I've got this sort of revision aid like I'm doing my A-levels. And I've had the pleasure of sitting next to Roger and scribbling all these notes, so thank you, Roger. So one of the things that I'm thinking about on that night, the first question was around, actually the general election itself. What are the things I'm preparing myself for that we might anticipate? I think one of the first things is, the first thing that happens on the night is the exit polls that the BBC and ITV do together. Channel 4 doesn't have an exit poll, so everyone's going to be paying attention to that. And, the exit poll recently has tended to be pretty accurate. But they've got a real challenge this time because of the boundary changes. The exit poll is really quite a unique poll in that it goes to polling stations and looks at how people voted last time and asks people as they're leaving how did they vote this time. So they're measuring change. And all the analysts in the room will know that's probably a better way of trying to capture the change than just doing a snapshot. But they're not going to be able to measure change that way this time. So I know that the people who are in charge of the exit poll are all pretty nervous this time. So that's something to look out for. And then the second thing that Roger's been talking about is the multi-level regressions with post-stratification, which have been everywhere. And one of the fantastic things about them is they've got much bigger sample sizes, which, as Roger said, means that you actually have some data about what's going on in constituencies, which with traditional polls of 1,000 or 2,000 people, you can't do that. So even in your raw data, you're able to see some of these trends. But then they run models on it, looking at social demographics and other characteristics to see, are young people more likely to vote Labour? Well, this constituency's, a retirement area by the seaside. It's got lots more older people. How are they likely to vote? So they rely much more heavily on the modelling choices of the analysts like Roger. Now, they've been pretty accurate in the few years that we've had them. So are they going to continue to be this time? And Roger's very confident they will be. I think they probably will be, but I do think there are some risks. If there's such a high for example, in 2001, we had the lowest ever turnout that we'd ever had in a general election, and young people are less likely to turn out. So you see a bigger effect of age in that election. But I'm concerned if there's such a huge sweep towards Labour that you could get kind of a ceiling effect that demographics might not be as important. So maybe some of those MRP polls that are really pushing to the higher end of those, and you're not one of those, are you? I mean, some have even got suggesting 50 seats for the Conservatives. Maybe some of those are putting too much emphasis on some of those other variables in their models, but we will find out. But one of the other things besides, and Roger's talked about uniform national swing, one of the other measures that we've had of the fact that uniform national swing, which is not applied in the MRP polls but is in the standard polls, may not be working as well as it used to, is if we look at the recent local election results and the series of by-elections that we've had in the last year or so, where we've seen these massive swings, 20 percentage points towards Labour. And what that's shown is that the vote recently has been incredibly efficient. So you've got what you were describing, I think, Vernon, was an inefficient vote share where your vote is quite evenly spread across the country. But actually what you want is to be like the Liberal Democrats are right now. You want to have your vote targeted in places where you need it, not spread where you can't use it. And why is the vote more efficient? Because there's so much tactical voting. Roger's talked about the negativity, the anti-conservative feeling. There's a massive amount of negative partisanship in this election. It's not about the Tony Blair infatuation with Tony Blair and all the positive. I mean, if you look at what Blair's personal ratings were in 97, he was at +14. And Starmer is at -13. So exactly as Roger said, there's not this huge enthusiasm for Starmer. And so what we've got is a negatively driven election. And what do you do if you really want to get someone out? You behave strategically. You're not being driven by your commitment for a particular party. You want to get rid of someone. So you're organising, you're asking, you're thinking about which party can I vote for to get this one out? And that's one reason why we might expect this to be such a Labour landslide, because what we haven't talked about so far is the Liberal Democrats. And in places, you mentioned Michael Gove and Jeremy Hunt, they both have Surrey seats, which would traditionally have been incredibly strong Tory heartlands. But what's happened is this, under Boris Johnson, as the Conservatives pivoted to the Red Wall, they took places like Surrey, where I live, in Epsom, for granted. We've got them, they're in the bag. And I think what's about to happen is what happened to Labour in 2015 in Scotland, when they just lost their seats overnight. And it's what happened to Labour in the Red Wall at the last election, when they suddenly lost these seats they'd had for decades. And it's that taking for granted of safe seats, and we can be complacent about these votes, that I think the Blue Wall, potentially we're going to see some of these key Conservative seats being taken over by the Liberal Democrats. Why would that be? Well, you mentioned that I'm the director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Well, one of the things I've really noticed this election is that the targeting and segmenting of voters has had a very female flavour. I don't know if any of you have noticed Waitrose woman. I'm a bit fearful I might be one. Stevenage woman and Whitby woman. Why are all these targeted groups women? It's a bit unusual, to be honest. I've spent the last 20 years banging on around, we should notice that women vote too, and suddenly it's everywhere. The reason is that women are disproportionately represented amongst those who make up their mind later in the campaign, but they're just as likely to vote. So when the parties are getting their polling through about who do we need to persuade, then I say, oh, it's women, oh, it's women, oh, it's women. So that's why that's happening. But Waitrose woman, and apparently is somebody in one of those kind of wealthy, traditional Conservative seats who's voted Conservative in the past, but is critically worried about the environment, is worried about the NHS, and cares about things like the BBC, doesn't like the culture wars rhetoric that the Conservative Party has been adopting, and could well turn to Liberal Democrats. And we've seen the Liberal Democrats having success in by-elections amongst that kind of voter. Whereas Stevenage woman is a voter in a marginal constituency, a bellwether constituency, but much less well off than Waitrose woman, struggling with the cost of living, struggling with family finances, and looking for the economy to be improved. And Whitby woman is a woman living in an area that's being heavily targeted by reform, but actually has doubts about reform. And if you look at the reform vote, it is 2/3 or more men who are likely to support the reform rather than women. So actually, what might curtail reform's chances in some of the seats it'd like to win is that it is not appealing to women voters who share a lot of the economic experience of the men in those constituencies, but for some reason don't like Nigel Farage. I find it hard to put my finger on what it is about him they don't like, but if you look at leader ratings by gender, there's usually nothing going on. Men and women feel the same about the leaders. You put Nigel Farage into the mix and women hate him. He is so unpopular with women. And that is something the Conservative Party need to think about after the next election, because if some of these wild fantasies about him becoming the leader of the Conservative Party take hold, historically, before 2017, Conservative Party always got more women's votes than men's. It lost them in 2017 and 2019. And I can tell you one thing that will make absolutely certain they don't get them back. Make Nigel Farage the leader. So those are things that I think we'll be looking out for on the day. Also, it's very likely the proportion of women in Parliament will go up from 34% to 40%, and that's simply because half of Labour MPs now are currently women and half of their candidates are women, and that's compared to the Conservatives, where about 23% of their MPs are women. So it's just because of the fact that Labour's likely to do so well that we would see that. So after the election, I think after 2015, we had a huge conversation about a constitutional crisis, what was going to happen in terms of the constitutional settlement. There's a really good chance that's just going to go away. Because, it could well be that the Labour Party, there's so many marginal seats now in Scotland, the Labour Party really gains much more representation in Scotland. And John Sweeney and the SNP seem to have said that if they get a majority of seats, that is an endorsement for another referendum. Well, what does it mean if they don't? That seems to mean no more referendum. And then the other question that I think is really going to be important is proportionality. We might see a situation where the Labour Party gets about 40% of the vote and maybe up to 70% of the seats in the House of Commons. Anyone who looks at that is going to say that's pretty unfair. But who's going to be the person talking loudest about that? Nigel Farage. If you're a politician who is the head of a majority party in Parliament, what lessons about Nigel Farage carping on the outside about having a referendum might you have learnt recently? You know, I think if you are the Labour Party and Nigel Farage is saying we really need to think about electoral reform, there is absolutely no way that they will give an inch. I think what's much more likely is that we'll see votes at 16. And if you look at the age demographic of voting behaviour, now if you're under 50, and this election it may be even older than that, you're more likely to vote Labour than Conservative. So that's the more likely constitutional change. In terms of what we might see immediately after, prisons are full. The minute that the very likely Keir Starmer steps into office, he does not have anywhere for people who are being found guilty of criminal offences right now to be sent. And he's going to have to make decisions about what's going to happen to them. That is going to be extremely unpopular with a lot of voters. So he's going to immediately be faced by a prison crisis. And I think we have to remember, exactly as Roger said, that this victory we assume he's going to have, this seismic historic victory, is built entirely on sand. It is not built on a positive support for the Labour Party. It's built on a negative feeling towards the Conservatives. And just as quickly as it could change, opinions just change, it could change again. So how long does Keir Starmer and the Labour Party have to deliver the promises that they've made, which we all might agree are fairly limited anyway? I think a very, very short time. And my final point is my biggest concern after the election is I'm not at all concerned about the so-called supermajority for Labour, because frankly, if you've got 80 or 200 a majority, you can push your legislation through Parliament. That isn't the issue. The collapse of the Conservative Party will be a massive problem for this country. It will leave a space for the far right that we see gaining ground in Europe to make a space for itself and establish itself in the UK. Some projections are saying, and I hope that these are on the extreme side, that for reform might get up to 19 seats. I hope that isn't the case. But if we see a real collapse of the Conservative Party, I don't think anybody should be celebrating who cares about democracy and sensible, centrist, moderate politics.
Thank you very much indeed, Rosie. I knew Farage would come up eventually, so we've got him, and I think we might get some more of him. I don't want to predict, but so finally we have Vernon Bogdanor, who's Professor of Government, author of numerous books which many of us in this room will have read, including recently Strange Survival of Liberal Britain, and a forthcoming book due in September called Making the Weather, 6 Politicians Who Changed Britain. And in case you're wondering, the 6 politicians in question are Nigel Van, Tony Benn, Roy Jenkins, Enoch Powell, Keith Joseph, and Nigel Farage, which is going to be an interesting one to read and will require perhaps updating on July the 5th. So please, Vernon.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, Andrew, but I fear what I have to say is a bit grim, and people may want a stiff drink after hearing what I've got to say, but yes, well, you'll need a stiff one. Now, Roger said quite rightly that the election appears to most people dull, but because the outcome appears preordained. But I think it's a fascinating election, and I'm going to give 8 reasons why I think it's a very fascinating election. First, I think it's the only election since the war in which most people feel worse off than they were at the time of the last election. One poll that I've seen says 60% feel that the country and they themselves are worse off than they were in 2019. And that, you may say, is an inevitable result of COVID and the Ukraine war, added to which the fall in growth since the 2008 credit crunch, which was before that was on average 2.5% a year. Since then, it's struggled to reach 2%, often lower. The Labour Party say it will raise the rate of growth and raise productivity. I'm interested to know how. Energy prices have risen by about 90% in the last 3 years, though they've recently been falling a bit, not as much as 90%. Food prices up by 31%, car insurance 24%, postal services 19%. We've been in the longest recession for 70 years. Taxes at their highest since 1951, 36% of GDP, highest public spending, highest immigration, over twice what it was when we were in the EU. In this Parliament, 2 million people gross have come into the country, nearly 2 Birminghams. And you may remember one of the motivations of those who voted Brexit was to control our borders. Polls, incidentally, consistently show the Rwanda policy has more supporters than opponents. A Delta poll survey that I've seen, 45% support it, 32% oppose, 23% don't know. Now, the cost of living is clearly a top issue for most people. And if you are a Conservative, you may say, well, none of this is our fault. COVID, the Ukraine war, we need to conquer inflation. But of course, people don't look at the fine print. And there seem no obvious advantages of Brexit, which the Conservative Party, it's fair to remember, under Cameron were opposed to Brexit, it's not remembered now, and there's a strong feeling of regret. And with immigration being what it is, we're a long way from David Cameron's promise to reduce immigration to tens of thousands. And all this damages the reputation of the Conservatives as the party of effective economic management. And you may say, whatever people thought of Sunak or Starmer or Boris Johnson or anyone else, could any government have conquered all that and had a reasonable chance of being re-elected? Perhaps a political genius could have turned things round. You may say it was inevitable. But Rishi Sunak, no doubt, got many admirable qualities, but I don't think anyone would call him a political genius. And I just wonder if any government could have conquered what's happened since 2019. And then if things weren't bad enough, despite high taxation, the poor state of the public services. The Institute of Government did a survey in which they showed that schools were the only ones of the 9 public services performing better than in 2010 in the 14 years of Tory rule. No one needs to be reminded of the state of the NHS. Prisoners are being released early and the police are asked not to make too many arrests. In the criminal courts, over a quarter of serious cases take over a year to be resolved. In adult social care, there are around 180,000 vacancies. There's sewage in the rivers and the sea. But even with the schools, 100 were not able to open last September because of structural problems and fear of the collapse of the buildings. 7 local authorities are bankrupt, and they include not just Labour ones, but Conservative as well. For 30 years before 2019, just 1 went bankrupt. The Institute of Government's percentage of those who think a service is going well, Brexit 6%, housing 7%, unemployment 8%, though unemployment's fairly low, education 10%, though reading standards and the like have improved over the last 14 years, immigration 11%, NHS 12%, crime 13%, inflation 15%, economy 21%, defence 31%. As Roger said, Labour leads on every single issue, including immigration. There's just one exception, the pensioners, and the Conservatives become the pensioners' party. They've done very well, but as the audience won't need me to remind them, the young have done very badly. Sunak has announced no tax on income from state pension, in effect protecting the pensioners from inflation, index linking the state pension. So we've got the triple lock, plus the protection of pensioners from inflation, which costs £2.5 billion a year. The IMF says even the triple lock without the tax benefit is unaffordable. Now, pensions are the most important issue for just 3% of the electorate. You won't be surprised for over 65s, 21% think it's the most important. And for 2019, Conservatives proposing to defect, 14% think is the most important. And pensioners also are strongly in favour of national service, though the young aren't, and they're in favour of the attack on so-called Mickey Mouse degrees in universities. Now, for people who are not pensioners, there's continuing fiscal drag, no uprating of the personal allowance in line with inflation. Sunak froze the thresholds as Chancellor in 2021, so it's a stealth tax. And this, for working people, outweighs the effect of Jeremy Hunt's national insurance reductions. Now, the pensioners, people perhaps still think of pensioners as poverty-stricken, but they're actually a very wealthy age cohort with high asset wealth and disposable income. 1/5 of over 65s are millionaires in terms of household wealth. That is, assets such as property, their pension pot, as well as money in the bank. And the baby boomers, now pensioners, have done very well indeed. In the 1970s, house prices were on average 5 times earnings. They're now 9 times earnings. These benefits, however, are unsustainable. When the pension was introduced in 1908, just 5% lived to retirement age. In 2022, it's 19%. In 2040, it will be 24%. And there are fewer potential workers per pensioner, 4.5 in 1972, 3.3 today. And the obvious answer is means test the state pension. But that, as Sir Humphrey would say, would be a very courageous decision, Prime Minister. Now, the young, as you all know, have done worse. National service will cost another £2.5 billion a year were it to be introduced, to be taken from the Levelling Up Fund. And you may have seen one young man who was being introduced to the Prime Minister who thought that he'd say, very glad to meet you, Prime Minister, but he said instead, why do you hate the young? And just 8% of 18 to 24-year-olds intend to vote Conservative. Their tuition fees have gone up and their debt has increased. They suffered more from COVID than other people with a less valuable higher education experience, lectures and tutorials online, no university clubs, sport, parties and the like. Find it more difficult to buy a house, and the Conservatives now want them to undertake mandatory unpaid social work at the weekend or join the army. The question is, will turnout among the young increase? It's very low. When I gave a lecture at King's in 2005, I told my young students that an old person's vote was worth twice as many as theirs because there were twice as many old people and they were twice as likely to vote. That got me something which hasn't happened to many academics, I think. I got a telephone call from Cosmopolitan. And I thought, well, they want my photo on the cover, but they didn't. They said there were just 33% of women 18 to 24 who voted. How can that be increased? But the figure at the last election was a bit better. 47% of young people 18 to 24 voted, but 74% of those over 65, the old vote and the young vote, the young don't. And you may think that's one of the reasons why the old are treated so much more generously from governments than the young, and why pensioners are treated better than people who rely on student fees. So that's the first reason the election's interesting, that people are so much worse off, except for the pensioners. The second is, in terms of public opinion, the polls seem not to have moved. Now, there have in fact been large movements of opinion, but fortuitously, perhaps Roger will say the reason, fortuitously, they seem roughly to have balanced out. Large swings of opinion because of less party identification, more interest in the minor parties. And this stability, apparent stability, makes it difficult for the media to make the election appear exciting. To the extent that the polls have changed, it's slightly widened the gap between the Tories and Labour and yield an increase in the Reform vote and also for the Lib Dems. Now, the polls have been the same roughly for over 2 years, showing Labour with a lead of around 20%. And they moved against the Conservatives at that time, with Partygate and Liz Truss, I think, being two important factors. And sometimes the campaign can alter matters, and people may remember 2017, when Theresa May started out with a 20% lead, which was reduced to 2% at the time of the election. But more often, they don't, and people have stopped listening, and people don't change their votes in net terms that much. And the polls aren't, despite Roger's caveats, the polls aren't that much wrong generally either. Now, why is that? Let me look at an example from the past which may be relevant. I look at 1979, when James Callaghan's Labour government was forced to go to the country after losing a vote of confidence after a wave of public sector strikes called the Winter of Discontent. And Labour began the campaign around 10% behind. But Callaghan played on fears that a Conservative government would mean a rise in prices, and the polls started to move in Labour's favour. One of Callaghan's advisors suggested that Labour might pull off an unexpected victory, and Callaghan's first response was, "Yes, I fear we might." But his second, more considered reaction was this: there are times, perhaps once every 30 years, when there is a sea change in politics. It then does not matter what you say or what you do. There is a shift in what the public wants and what it approves of. I suspect there is now such a sea change, and as for Mrs. Thatcher, he was right, and the election saw a 5% swing to the Conservatives, at that time the largest since the war. But if Roger's right, we're going to see a much larger swing than that next week. But is there now a sea change as there was in 1979? People aren't listening to the Conservatives, clearly. No, there isn't a sea change, because Labour's not offering much different from the Conservatives. Most of its promises are about what they will not do. There are no concrete plans for how to improve the health service, cut the cost of living, cut immigration, secure growth, increase productivity. And if I were a Conservative, I could derive some comfort by saying, we've lost the election, but we won the argument, because there seems no radical alternative, or at least not one being espoused by Labour. So this is the third reason why the election's so odd. There's not much confidence in the current state of affairs. People don't like it, they don't feel happy with it. But the opposition's not preparing to alter it to any significant extent. And nor, as Roger and others have said, is there much enthusiasm for Labour. I mean, contrast 1997, when there was a sense of energy with a very strong economy. In 1997, the slogan was, "Things can only get better." Now perhaps the slogan is, "Things can hardly get any worse." A YouGov poll shows little enthusiasm for Labour. Do you think Labour's competent? 38%. Incompetent? 28%. Even amongst Labour voters, just 52% regard as competent. Is Labour united? 31%. Divided? 33%. Labour ready to form the next government? 39% yes, 37% no. In 1997, Tony Blair had a plus 22 score. Ipsos Mori, is Labour fit to govern? 31%. 28% only think favourably of Starmer. Is Starmer likeable? 28%. Dislikable? 43%. Do you trust Starmer? 26%. No, 35%. Is he decisive? 26%. Indecisive? 47%. Strong? 28%. Weak? 38%. So if voters could tick the box none of the above, that might win. And that's a clear sign of something important, I think, that many people in the country feel the political system is not working for them. And that was one of the causes of Brexit, Boris Johnson's victory in 2019, and the rise in support for Reform UK. So it's a failed consensus, but neither of the main parties is proposing to alter it, because radicalism has been discredited by Jeremy Corbyn, by Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. You could imagine in theory two possible alternatives to the current system. You could imagine a radical left calling for greater use of the state, higher taxes on the better off to finance improvements in the public services, the sort of position that Jeremy Corbyn would be taking, the Greens, George Galloway. Or you could imagine another alternative of the radical right to make the best use of Brexit, a fourth term of Margaret Thatcher, funded tax cuts, cuts in subsidies, regulations and tariffs, reform of the public services, perhaps an insurance model for the NHS as in France or Germany. Now that's would be the option of people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and John Redwood. And that's been ruined by Liz Truss and Kwarteng. But Reform is offering something near to that, which a lot of its supporters don't realise. It's the Thatcherite party, but most of its supporters tend to become from those who've not done well economically and want more protection against economic forces, not less. So that's a problem for Reform. Now, the Labour Party loses elections when people are frightened. In 2019, clearly they were frightened about Jeremy Corbyn. Throughout the 1980s, they were frightened of the trade unions and of Michael Foot. They're no longer frightened by Labour. You may be bored by Keir Starmer, but you can't be frightened by him. And then this is a fourth reason why it's a very odd election, the great rapidity with which Labour has recovered from the debacle of 2019. And many said the Conservatives be in for a generation, the natural party of government, because after 1979, it took them another 3 elections to get back. And after 1997, it took the Conservatives another 2 elections to get back. Labour's got back in 1 election. And perhaps many of those people who said in 2019 the Tories would be in for a generation are saying the same about Labour now in 2024, which is with as little justification. Now, Starmer's achievement then seems colossal, but perhaps it's less of a positive achievement than it seems, because it's a punishment election. People want to punish the Conservatives, and they can punish them by voting for Starmer because he's removed the fear. And he's also shown something else significant. You don't need to be a charismatic leader to win an election. 2 previous landslides to the left in 1906 and 1945 were won by leaders who were very far from charismatic, Henry Campbell Bannerman and Clement Asquith. And also Stanley Baldwin, very far from charismatic, won huge majorities for the Conservatives in 1924 and 1935. But as I say, although Starmer's mantra is change, he's not offering anything very different. Previous landslides mostly herald change. 1906, 1945, 1983, 1997. This is a no-change election. If you're radical, you might feel that you should vote for the Greens, Galloway's Workers' Party if you're on the left, or Reform UK if you're on the right. And the election, as I say, is not about ideology, because alternative ideology is discredited, and not even competence, because not many think Labour will be competent, but punishment. Now, the 5th reason why the election is odd, the increasing support for the smaller parties and the low support for the 2 major parties, perhaps a result of the opinion polls indicating the virtual certainty of a Labour landslide. Now, Reform agrees with Labour. It's time for a change. Their priorities are very different. Immigration, the culture wars, national identity. If you're a 2019 Conservative voter, you may feel that, as Farage and Tice say, they are semi-socialist. High taxation, high public spending, a high level of immigration. Tice calls it the immigration election. And by contrast with 2019, support for them is coming almost overwhelmingly from the Conservatives. In 2019, they stood down in Conservative seats and gained support from both parties. An opinion poll asked, do you agree with Farage the Reform Party is a new Conservative movement? 30% yes, 26% no. Even amongst Conservatives, 29% yes, 29% no. And compare the vitality of Reform with the failure of the Labour breakaway after 2015, of Labour MPs disenchanted with Corbyn, led by Chaka Umuna, previously slated as a possible Labour leader. They disappeared without trace. This breakaway to the right has been proved to have more vitality than the breakaway to the centre. Now, although Farage, of course, was against the EU, the Reform Party puts him in line with developments on the continent and perhaps also the US, which is the growth of the radical right. Marine Le Pen, Maloney, the AfD, Donald Trump. Survey evidence in many of those countries shows they have particular support amongst the young. So here Britain's an outlier because we are moving to the moderate left, not the radical right, and there's no evidence that I've seen of disproportionate support by the young for the radical right. We're an outlier. I ask the question, for how long? Are there similar trends in the advanced democracies which Britain at the moment is escaping? Now, with the Greens, like Reform, there's a disparity between the views of the leaders, which tend to be on the left and interventionist, but the voters tend to be affluent and believers in the free market. With the Workers' Party, led by George Galloway, they're hoping to secure the Muslim vote. Muslims are now 6% of the population, 14 times as many Muslims as there are Jews. In 2019, they were 80% Labour, but in previous elections rather less so. Now they're 56% Labour and 6% Liberal Democrat. Now Galloway fits their profile. He's economically left, but culturally right. He supported Brexit, unlike others on the left. He's a practicing Catholic who accepts Catholic social teaching, and the Muslims also tend to be very traditionalist in their religious views. However, I think it's unlikely to affect Labour very strongly for 2 reasons. Firstly, Gaza is the main concern of just 20% of Muslims, so not for 80%. For the rest of them, their concerns are the same as most other voters: cost of living, NHS, even immigration. Secondly, they're mostly in safe Labour seats, so even a switch in the Muslim vote would not cost Labour more than 2 or 3 seats at the very most, not even certain that Galloway will hold Rochdale. I now come to my 6th reason as to why this is an interesting election, because this, as John Curtis has said, is our first 6-party election. You've got the Workers' Party, the Greens, and the Liberal Democrats, and then the Reform Party, as well as the 2 major parties. In Scotland and Wales, it's a 7-party election. And the Labour landslide, as people have said, is on about 40% of the vote, about the same percentage that Jeremy Corbyn won in 2017, so 3/5 of the country probably against it. The 2-party vote on Rogers' figures is about 61%, the lowest since the party system came into existence after the First World War. The second lowest was 65% in 2010. Reform will get quite a considerable vote, a few millions, but hardly any seats at all. In 2015, UKIP gained 1/8 of the vote, but no seats. And the Reform probably get more votes than the Liberal Democrats, but fewer seats. In 1983, the left suffered from a split vote, the Liberal-SDP alliance, which gave Margaret Thatcher a 144 majority on 42% of the vote, 2% less than in 1979 when her majority was just 43. Now the right will be suffering from a split vote, will be grossly underrepresented in Parliament. So the only constitutional issue, as we've heard, is that proportional representation is back on the agenda. But PR, as has already been implied, will not benefit, as we thought, the Liberal Democrats and the Centre, but the Tory right and Farage. Farage has come top in 2 national elections run by PR. For the European Parliament in 2014 and 2019, on 26% and 30% of the votes respectively. And in 2019, the Conservatives in those elections gained just 9% of the vote, which finished off Theresa May. Roy Jenkins in the 80s used to say PR would strengthen the centre. It strengthened Farage. Proportional representation for the European Parliament gave him that foothold, which expanded into a bridgehead. PR for the devolved bodies and the London Assembly gave people the idea that it might be sensible to vote for a minor party. And PR for the Commons would help Reform much more than the Liberal Democrats. And I have to say that Farage is the most underestimated politician in Britain today and has been for many years. Without him, Cameron might not have had to make the commitment to the referendum, and we might not have left the European Union, which is the most consequential foreign policy decision this country's made since the war. And Farage has achieved that without ever having been elected to the House of Commons, without ever being a member of Parliament or a minister, and leading just a minor party. It's a remarkable achievement, which makes Farage, I think, one of the 2 most influential politicians in post-war Britain. I think the other one is Keith Joseph, Margaret Thatcher's guru. Now, the next Tory leader will almost certainly be from the right, because chosen by the members. Indeed, only once in the post-war era has a party elected someone less radical after losing the election, and that was in the very distant circumstance of 1955, when Labour elected Hugh Gaitskell to replace Attlee. That was when only MPs chose. Every other election, parties have elected someone they thought more radical after losing an election. So there's a 7th reason, in my opinion, why this election is of such interest, and likely in the long run to benefit the right, because both parties are led by centrist leaders who are uncharismatic, who fail in the first requirement of a politician, that they cannot communicate. And you may have seen the debate last night in which one member of the audience said to Sunak and Starmer, "Are you the best this country can provide?" Farage is the only leading politician who can communicate with the public. And the mood is of no enthusiasm for either of the main parties, disappointment with the outcome of Brexit, alienation from politicians and apathy. The very forces that have strengthened the radical right on the continent and America are feeling the political system is not working. And I expect, as I think Roger does, a very low turnout. And I have to say, I myself have contemplated for the first time in my life not voting, though I have in fact voted by post. The last reason why the election is of such interest, it's the most dishonest election of my lifetime. No doubt most elections are dishonest, but this one is more dishonest than most. Current public finances, declares Oxford economist Dieter Helm, will be revealed to be unsustainable, and therefore they will not be sustained. The IFS say we have the worst fiscal election since the immediate post-war period, so you may say it's a good election to lose. On current plans, there needs to be a cut of at least 2% a year in unprotected services. That's £20 billion. That's excluding protected services such as the NHS and defence. Now, the main unprotected services are local government and the Justice Department, already reeling from 14 years of austerity. Then we have to bring defence up to 2.5% of GDP, which will cost around £10 billion. Jeremy Hunt cut £10 billion off national insurance, and the opposition says they're not going to reverse it. Abolishing national insurance, the Tory aspiration, would cost £40 billion. Now, voters can see the results in terms of local government, in terms of potholes in the road and dustbins not being emptied frequently, and local government has been reduced to its main statutory services, social care and looking after vulnerable children. And if immigration is restricted, this will affect social care, which relies on cheap labour from other countries. I came back recently from Romania, where wages are about 1/5 of the level of this country. If you want to cut immigration, you have to raise wages radically in the social care sector, where there are 180,000 vacancies. And since 57% of university fee income comes from overseas, you must also raise tuition fees and or increase government spending on the universities, or many universities will be in serious financial trouble. So, if you want to invest in public services like the NHS and end austerity, indeed, even if you want to maintain current spending, you have to have large tax rises. For example, both parties are committed to an increase in the NHS workforce, involving after 15 years 2% more of GDP, another 900,000 people, in total £50 billion. How is it to be financed? It can't be financed by VAT on public schools. That's a drop in the ocean. Nor by tweaking council tax or inheritance tax. We're talking about something like raising income tax rates by 6% or raising the standard rate of VAT by 7%. And Labour says it's not going to raise any of the largest taxes. Now, I think even a Labour government cannot alter the laws of arithmetic. And certainly there's no scope for tax cuts. Whoever wins will have to raise taxes. And as I said, they're built into the system by the freezing of tax thresholds. Labour say they can increase productivity and growth. Absurd this can be done in the short term. And the danger is that Labour assumes a higher rate of growth, as in the Wilson-Callaghan years. The markets will react and we'll be back to inflation. So I foresee rapid public disillusionment with Labour. They are proposing to cut NHS waiting lists by 2 million, provide 700,000 more dental appointments and increase overtime pay for NHS staff. £7.3 billion on a national wealth fund to create jobs in a zero-carbon economy. £2.5 billion for a British jobs bonus. Recruiting 6,500 new staff in schools. Breakfast clubs in primary schools. Better accommodation for our armed forces. 13,000 more neighbourhood police. 1,000 extra caseworkers to deal with backlogs in asylum applications. There's great danger for raising taxes after insisting that you won't. Older people may remember the older Bush in 1988. Watch my lips. No tax increases. If the Conservatives are enthralled to the pensioners, Labour to the public sector middle class. How are they going to resolve that dilemma? So I see the beneficiaries as being those on the right, which will put us in line with the continent. And perhaps it's scant comfort for Remainers. We may become more like the continent in becoming more populist and more illiberal. Nevertheless, I think we'll survive whatever happens next Thursday. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vernon. And I seem to remember in 1964, Labour got elected on an economic growth platform. Yeah. It didn't work, and after a few years, reneging on a previous policy pledge, they applied for membership of the European Economic Community. But I'll leave that point there. But I propose, we've overrun a bit, we take 10 minutes of questions.
As I was reading the Financial Times this week, looking at the kind of poll of polls, and decline in the Conservative vote seems totally unsurprising to me, given kind of what's happened. But the thing that seems slightly more surprising to me is the kind, and please comment if my eyes are looking at these graphs correctly, is a sort of very gradual decline in the Labour vote. And this kind of surprised me because the Labour campaign overall has been pretty good. And also I kind of think everything and obviously I totally take what people say about Starmer et al., but that surely has been kind of priced in right at the start of the campaign. I don't think voters have learned anything massively new to update their preferences. I don't think reform has massively impacted the Labour vote. And also you'd expect a kind of bandwagon effect, wouldn't you, that as the poll gets closer, people like to banner back the potential winner. Obviously the difference won't make much difference in terms of seats, because the average poll difference is remaining the same, if not improving. But I just wonder if panellists could comment, if they agree with me, that is, that there does appear to this kind of decline in Labour support.
Anyone want to come in on?
Well, I've actually got a little table in front of me in my revision notes that David Cowling, formerly of the BBC, did, that shows you, so if you look at the pre-campaign, the average poll of polls for Labour was 44. It's now 41. The average for Conservative was 24, is now 20. The average for Reform was 11, now 17. So John Curtis always said Reform was taking about 2/3 of its voters from previous Conservative vote, but there is still a small amount that's coming from Labour. So to me, the guru here will have a better answer, but to me it doesn't look like an anomaly.
No, I'm frankly not surprised by it. Very clearly, the key to Labour's strategy in this election is caution. They've got the big pile of plates, they do not want to drop them. And on the whole, that's working. Their vote hasn't collapsed. But it's also very dull. It does not come across to the people who think it's definitely time for a change. And some of them are looking at Starmer and saying, well, where's the change? You look at the policies that Labour's promising. My colleagues did a poll on the manifestos a couple of weeks ago. So went through getting a list of all the policies from each of the parties. And when they'd drawn up the list, the Labour list and the Conservative list are almost identical. All Labour is saying is we're going to do the same as the Conservatives, we're going to do it better. And it's not surprising that some of the people who are just fed up with the current state of things are looking for a party that's wanting to express that more dramatically, i.e. reform. But in strategic terms, Starmer's right, because not many of them are doing it. Labour is still 6 weeks on from that, looking as if they're going to win next week, and win big.
My question really is going on from what Professor Bogdanor was talking about at the end of his talk, and really to talk about the level of debt. I think we're not quite a member of the 100% club, but we're not far off it now. I think it's 98% of debt to GDP. And I think in the last financial year, it cost north of 100 billion to service that, which is, for example, an awful lot more than we're spending on defence, nearly twice as much. So my question is, how much is that going to impact on the next government? How far can they allow debt to increase or feel the need to reduce it? And perhaps a second question coming from the...
No, we'll have to have one question per person, sorry. And can we go to the person in the red T-shirt there, and then the person in the blue shirt behind them for two more? Sorry, but
Thank you for today. I think this is for Professor Campbell. I think you mentioned earlier about the danger of reform getting in is emblematic of the same problem of allowing Nigel Farage to have a voice in the first place in terms of Brexit, and it represents a similar wave coming across Europe. But I wonder what you think of that, considering we are one of the only countries in Europe where a nominally left-wing party is about to have a massive supermajority, which is not quite the same, controlling for electoral systems. It's not the same in Germany and France. And maybe the fact is we listened to Farage once and realised how bad of an idea it was. So maybe that's seeped into the national consciousness.
Working. Yeah, can I ask all members of the panel, there's been mention of low turnout generally across several of the remarks. Could you all have a punt and have a suggestion of what the actual turnout will be in the general election?
Brilliant. Sarah, do you want to start off with reacting to any of them, including that one?
No, I'll come last.
Okay. Rosie, then, you're next.
Yeah, I think you answered your own question. It's the electoral system, isn't it? I mean, Vernon was talking about the 2019 European election. Well, think, you know, the UKIP party came first in that election. In the same year, we had a general election when we had the highest two-party vote share we'd had for years. So the electorate understand the difference in those electoral systems. And so I personally think, exactly as was being said, that to some extent the electoral system is designed and could potentially protect us from the far-right insurgents. And so it would be incredibly foolish of a Labour Party that has managed to get a majority on the back of very little support to change the electoral system in that situation. So I think you're right that the tides are similar, but the electoral context is different. Vernon also picked up a point about younger voters and support for the radical right. It's actually younger men that are disproportionately supporting the radical right, and that is something that concerns me here, that we have got this kind of whole culture wars debate is operationalising that and targeting young men particularly. And we did some work with Ipsos for International Women's Day this year, where we've seen around the world that young men are more hostile to gender equality, more hostile on quite a lot of issues of progressive liberal values. And I think it's because we're failing to connect around, for example, 57% of higher education students in the UK are now men. That is not a success, that's a problem. And we're not having that conversation. Turnout, 58%, I guess.
Bold prediction, brilliant. Roger?
I'll leave the one on the sustainability of the economy to those of my colleagues who study more of the substance of government. I mean, I'm in the essentially the business of studying elections, which is rarely about substance. It's all about image and how that translates into the way people vote. And I will frankly admit I do not understand in great detail the workings of government, and neither do 95% of the voters, which is why I've got a job. So I'll stick to the one I understand. I'm guessing turnout at 60%. That is very much a guess, and it could go either way, but that's roughly what the indications in the poll say to me.
Thank you. Vernon, want to respond to
Well, the point about debt, I think, is very important, yes. And the markets tend to be more suspicious of Labour governments and give them less leeway than Conservative governments. And the Labour Party is more enthralled, as it were, to the public sector unions than the Conservatives. One wonders if the Labour Party would have been as strong in resisting public sector wage claims as the Conservatives have been. That's one of the reasons, I think, inflation has fallen. And as I said, the danger for Labour is that it thinks it's easy to get economic growth. In my opinion, economic growth is best secured by two factors: improvement in skills and improvement in infrastructure. And they take time to work their way. I mean, we didn't see the benefit of Margaret Thatcher's labour market reforms for some time. So I think there's a danger if Labour says, we've got the secret of growth, now we can spend as if we've already got economic growth, which is what Wilson did. It's fair to say in the 60s, people held a much more naive view. They said the way to get growth is simply to jack up demand and not have stop, go, and so on. And then they said, well, if we join the European community then was, that'll increase the rate of growth because we're in a larger market. And then they said if we have planning policies, we'll get better growth. And I think none of those have actually worked. On reform, I ought, perhaps to modify my remarks, and I begin by saying I was a Remain voter and I would never vote for reform, but it's probably not, it's not fair, I think, to link them with the parties on the continent, which are either explicitly or implicitly racist. I don't think myself the Reform Party is, nor the UKIP party. I mean, Farage's concern was to get people to vote against Europe. He didn't care whether they were white or black or brown or what they were, as long as they were against Europe. And I think it's not fair to say that it's a racist party. They're racist in it, but they're also racist, it's fair to say, in other parties. And worth remembering the Labour Party was explicitly rebuked for racism in the form of anti-Semitism under Jeremy Corbyn. So it seems to me reform's a perfectly legitimate choice for people to make, though it's also fair to say its policy, its programme is more dishonest than that of the other parties even, because it's proposing even more public expenditure and saying we can pay for it by eliminating waste in the civil service and cutting the numbers. Sorry?
What about what Farage said about Putin?
But that's not a racist comment.
No, I didn't say it's racist, but it's populist radical right at the moment, isn't it?
Well, I think it's a terrible blunder, because most of the sort of people who were conservatives and might be thinking of voting for reform would not favour that. And I've seen in one or two polls reform support going down since that comment was made. I think it's a bad misjudgment on his part. But I don't think that's not a racist comment. It's not something I agree with. It's not a racist comment.
But it's what people fear when they think about the right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not racist.
And now, Sarah, you were going to, and this is our roundup, by the way. So yeah, Sarah, were you going to make a prediction or not, or respond to any of those three questions?
I was going to say 60%, but since Roger's already said it, I'll say 61%, because if the result is a foregone conclusion, sure, a lot of people think there's no point voting, but a lot of people also want to be part of something. It's a change of government for the first time in 14 years, because a lot of people vote expressively, and they vote, voting is a matter of being part of a big event, so that might push that up a bit.
Thank you. Well, we will now carry on the conversation over the drinks. And is it in the next room? Is that correct? So if you can all go through there. Let's thank the panel once again.